is the founder of Christianity that we know. Not James, not the apostles, not Jesus. That's the fact, the evidence. We find constantly the way, the path being referred to here. Think about the path, the way in Islam. Constantly, the way to gain salvation is through following the law, through doing good deeds. Another fascinating thing is, it refers to the return of the Messiah. Not the resurrection, but the return at the end of the world. We know too what Islam teaches about that. There is too much here which is very profound, which is why even Robert Eisenman makes the links through to Islam. Islam is so deeply perfect. We can see, as the Qur'an says, the fulfillment of the way through the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, through the Holy Qur'an. One fascinating thing which has been clarified by these Dead Sea Scrolls is we find Paul again, this Antichrist. Paul, let's get my pages right. Paul says, because any newcomer has only to proclaim a new Jesus, different from the one that we preached, or you have to receive a new spirit, different from the one you have already received, or a new gospel, different from the one you have already accepted, and you welcome it with open arms. As far as I can tell, these arch-apostles have nothing more than I have. Now Paul refers to these people who are trying to lead them away as the arch-apostles. Don't listen to them, Paul says. Don't listen to them. Now, what do we find? The Revised Standard Version translation calls them superlative apostles. The Good News translation calls them very special so-called. What does this all mean? Until now, it has been open, and nobody in Christianity really questioned this. Whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls refers to the arch-apostles, whom he, Paul, calls Satan's servants and dishonest workmen disguised as apostles of Christ. So Paul is meaning these arch-apostles are disguised workmen of Satan. But who are the arch-apostles? The arch-apostles, James, Peter, Matthew, the actual apostles of Jesus himself, who Paul is calling Satan's servants. Now, who do you believe? The myriad of people who walked, lived, listened to, continued to teach the teachings of Jesus? Or do you believe one man who on a road to Damascus had a vision unwitnessed, and claiming his interpretation of Christianity came from that one vision? He was a madman! Has to be. When all of it went against what the actual disciples, apostles of Jesus were teaching. Now we can understand why James himself referred to Paul as being pregnant with lies and a belly full of deceit. They're the words of James. The actual written words of James about Paul himself. Fascinating. Now, who was James? Well, history tells us a lot about that. James was one of the high priests of the temple in Jerusalem. He was known as James the Just, James the Righteous. He was also known in the Gospels as James, the brother of Jesus. Now, whether he was literally the brother of Jesus is open to debate, or whether that was a term of endearment. Could well be. In Acts chapter 21, 30 to 31, it refers to a large group of people besieging the temple. and the Romans having to come and to rescue an unnamed man from the onslaught. So a large group of people come into the temple and have to rescue an unnamed man. But who does Clement of Alexander say this man is? Clement of Alexander says that a cohort of Roman soldiers entered into the temple to rescue Paul. That was the unnamed man. Clement refers to the enemy bursting in, that's Paul, into the temple to attack James and his listeners. And that comes from writings called Recognition of Clement, chapter 1, verse 70. Clement also writes, at this time there were two high priests in the temple. The one who was in situ with the blessing of Rome, who was called Ananus, and the other in place by popular demand of the people, was James the Just. Two high priests, one a puppet of Rome, the other by choice of the people, James the Just. Even Josephus, the well-known historian of the day, writes of the Sanhedrin, the religious high courts, calling James before them, and James the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. That comes from his writings, Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 20, verse 9. Repeat it. James the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. That's what Josephus writes. It's called before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin accused him of breaking the law and stoning James to death. War then followed. And so too came the destruction of the temple. And the temple, as we know, has never been rebuilt. Now can we see why Paul, in his letters, was at pains to continually justify his position. Who are we to believe? What is the true Christianity? These are deeply relevant questions. The Dead Sea Scrolls illustrate how revelation came through the angel Gabriel. We see how the language is so much closer to Islam. The early Christians and Jesus were not pacifistic, but they were militant. They taught that you are saved by faith and by following the law. I haven't mentioned Eusebius, another famous early church historian from the 4th century. He refers to these early people as the Ebionites. They're poor because Ebionites means the poor. James, this is what he says, is held in high regard, whilst Paul is considered as the enemy or as the Antichrist. Eusebius is actually writing that in the 4th century. He tells us that they are people who have a low opinion of Christ. What does Eusebius mean by that? i.e., they're people who don't believe that Jesus is God. Christ, so Eusebius says, was born by natural means, an ordinary man, justified by his advances by righteousness only, following the law, good works. He insisted on complete observance of the law. They did not, and this is the early Christians, the followers of the way, the people following Jesus, did not believe in salvation through faith in Christ, but through doing good works. They observed the Jewish laws. Even Martin Luther, at the time of the Reformation, was conversant with these issues. And he himself demanded that they should never be a part of Christian literature, because he was aware of the awesome truth. And so the conspiracy went on. So, when you place the evidence in front of you, the apostles all referred to Paul as being the Antichrist. Paul, by his persuasive arguments, by following the passions of Satan, won over the hearts of the people. And that is how we have Christianity today. Remember what Paul said. Go to this nation and say, you will hear again, but not understand. See and see again, but not perceive. For the heart of this nation has grown coarse, their ears are dull of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, for fear they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and be converted and healed by me. He quoted Isaiah's words, the prophet Isaiah. Paul himself shut his eyes, just as we all people do today. But we have to keep them open. And through keeping them open, we actually find the path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to tread. That's the path, by His mercy, of Al-Islam.